Hello mamas and welcome back to the Pregnancy with Physio Laura podcast. Today's episode is all about what the first 2 weeks of my postpartum life and recovery looked like. This is episode 4 of 7 in the My Pregnancy and Birth podcast series. So if you haven't already listened to the first 3 episodes, you should definitely go back and listen to them first as I explain the entire pregnancy and birth story that led me to this postpartum recovery. Now, in today's episode, I share my initial thoughts when reflecting on my birth, our rhythms in the early days after birth, the boundaries I put in place to make sure I could rest, how I managed an afternoon nap every day for the first 2 weeks, my tips on getting good sleep and rest, how my body and pelvic floor felt, my emotional state after birth, how I helped my perineum recover, and so much more. Now, still to come in this series, I'll also be sharing my recovery from weeks 2 to 6 after birth, what exercise I was doing, how my pelvic floor felt, the differences in my recovery between a C-section and a vaginal delivery, and so much more. And then the final episode is all about how we transitioned to a family of 3 kids and my top tips and advice on what helped to make that a smooth transition. Now, let's get into episode 4 of this 7-part pregnancy and birth series, chatting all about the first few weeks after birth. Enjoy! Hello, ladies. I am jumping on today to talk all about my postpartum recovery for this third babe in the first 2 weeks. Now, the reason I divided it up into just a 0 to 2 week category is because I think that first 2 weeks is a real window of opportunity to maximize your recovery. So I've seen it in my clients, I've felt it in myself now. If you really hone in on doing the right things in the first 2 weeks, it can make an enormous difference for your recovery. So I wanted to just break down exactly what I did in those first 2 weeks and share my story on my postpartum recovery. So I thought I would start with my initial feelings coming home after giving birth, just to set the scene and be really real with you all. When I first came home, I felt very overwhelmed. So I will talk a little bit later about the transition to 3 children, but I came home, my kids had been away from me for 4 days, so they were fairly dysregulated. It was late at night. I was obviously recovering emotionally, physically, and it was dinner time and bath time. And I remember looking at my husband and just going, oh my God, this is full on. Like, what have we done? Life with 3 children. Whoa. It was an intense first night. So that was interesting. I just felt physically very, incapable. So I couldn't really help with my kids very much, nor did I want to, because I didn't want to push myself. I felt emotionally very stretched. I was exhausted. I was tired. And then I had 3 children to manage and look after and hold space for their emotional needs. And it was pretty full on. The other thing that I found very interesting as part of my recovery journey was I had this incredible, empowering, most amazing birth experience, but I also felt some negative vibes towards it. So what I mean by that, when I got home, I'd done a lot of laboring in my room, and when I got home, I saw the TENS machine, the Fitball, and I think I had the foam roller out as well, which are all props and tools that I had been using for labor. Now, I assume you've probably listened to my birth story. It was quite a long labor. It was quite an intense labor. And as soon as I saw them in my room, I felt this visceral reaction to them. Like, I need to get rid of them ASAP. Like, I couldn't stand looking at them. It brought back too many memories of this intense experience, and I just didn't want anything to do with it. And I started thinking, oh my God, do I have like a little bit of PTSD from my labor and my birth? How can it be that I've had this incredible, amazing, empowering experience, but I also feel like slightly traumatized maybe by it? Anyhow, I was aware of it. I didn't put too much meaning or emphasis or story on that. I just went, oh, that's interesting. I really feel this strong reaction to these props and this memory of my labor yesterday. I need to get rid of these out of my room ASAP. And I spoke to my doula about it the next day, and I said, do you find, is this common? Like I'm feeling like those memories are a bit too raw for me right now. And she said, don't stress. This happens to most people. Rarely do people give birth and straight away say, oh my God, I want to do that again. A lot of the time, people just need a little bit of space because it is such an intense experience. She said, you'll probably find as the days go on, you'll feel better and better and better about it, and it will feel less, I don't want to use the word traumatic because that's not really what I mean, but maybe intense, like less intense. And that is very true. So as the days went on, I felt more positive thoughts and vibes around it. I could look at my Fitball and not feel, ooh. And, certainly now, a couple of months down the track, I feel so positive about it. I would 100% have another baby and do that all again. So for anyone else that may also have experienced a similar thing, give it time. It certainly did help in my case. So that's how I felt initially postnatal. And then in terms of the daily rhythms, because I think it's nice to understand what those days looked like in the early days. So I would tend to wake up with baby Luca, which would be, sort of anywhere between 6 and 8 a.m. And my husband would get my other kids ready. So that means he would dress them, organize their breakfast, keep them entertained. We had an agreement that for the first 2 weeks, he was fully in charge of the other 2 kids and was to expect nothing of me other than to look after the baby. And I knew I needed to lay this expectation down so that not for him so much, but for me, so that I had a boundary around how much I was going to help, because I knew my personality was to want to jump in and help out and be involved. And I knew that that wouldn't serve me in my recovery so well. So he would get them ready, and then he would either take them out or maybe play with them, set up some sort of activity inside, while I was feeding the baby, changing nappies, all those sorts of things. Then often, let's be honest, I didn't have a shower every day. I'd probably try and have a shower every second day, and I would time this in the morning so all the kids were settled and fed and happy. I would feed the baby, and then I would go and have a shower straight away while my husband held her, and I would have, just a quick 5-minute shower or so. And that was just a perfect amount of solo time, and, just to feel a bit alive, feel fresh. And that was really, really lovely. And then in the afternoon, every single afternoon for the first 2 weeks, I committed to lying down or having a nap while she slept on my chest. So she would, babies sleep a lot in those first few weeks. And so pretty much at some stage in the afternoon, she would have a sleep, and I would make sure that when she had her sleep, she would lie on my chest and I would lie down, and whether I slept or whether I listened to a podcast or read a book or just, sat with my thoughts and looked out the window, I would always lie down. And so that would be really hard to do when my kids were at home. And fortunately, the weather was great, so my husband would always take them out in the afternoon. They'd get their fresh air, their exercise. I'd get my downtime, and it was a fantastic routine for those first 2 weeks. And then my husband would organize dinner. We did have a meal train, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but he would organize dinner. And so that I felt involved in the dinner routine and being with my other 2 kids, I would either sit at the table holding the baby or feeding the baby, or I would at least sit in my feeding chair near the table so I could engage in conversation, so that I was still part of that routine. And then at nighttime, we changed our routine a little bit just so that we could include everyone in it. I would sit and feed Luca to sleep. What we ended up doing, everyone came into our room and our bed where me and the baby were, and I would read books to my other 2 kids and, chat to them and be part of their nighttime routine. We would often include a baby bath or a baby shower while the other kids were showering and bathing, so that they were part of the routine with their new baby sister. And then we'd all get ready for bed together. And that was our way of including us all in the routine without me having to really be actively involved in it. So that was sort of our daily rhythm for the first 2 weeks. The most notable thing being that I had an afternoon rest or a lie down every single day. And that's something I never did with my first 2 kids. I never factored that in at all. I never organized before birth to have the space and the help to do that. And that was vital this time around. So if you can organize for your partner or your family or your friends or someone to help out with the other children, if this is not your first baby, so that you can lie down every afternoon, it made an enormous difference for me this time. Now, in terms of breastfeeding, This time round, I was very fortunate. I've always had a fairly smooth breastfeeding journey, good milk supply, good latch, those sorts of things. So being third time round, I had a lot of confidence, and touch wood, everything so far has gone very smoothly. I did have a small graze initially, that whole baby's got a tiny mouth, you've got a big nipple. The mechanics of it is not always fantastic. But I knew this time if the latch wasn't right to take baby off and then reattach rather than just putting up with the pain. I did get a small graze, but I used Maternal Instincts, which is Amberly Harris, who's been on the podcast before. I used her nipple balm. That made a big difference. That healed that up. And then touch wood, it has been fairly smooth sailing since. So I breastfeed on demand, which means I just feed. I joke that I parent by boob. So I fed both my kids for over a year, and if boob never worked to settle them, I was sort of out of options. So the breast has always been really good for me and my kids to help settle them, to feed them, to keep them nourished, all of those things. It kind of ticks all the boxes. So I breastfeed on demand. I also feed to sleep. I did need to be careful in the early days because I tend to have oversupply, and so I had to be mindful, especially because of the feeding to sleep routine that we do, is that she would want to suck sometimes, but she was getting too much milk. She just wanted to suck, but she didn't really want to feed. And then she'd get tummy pains, and then she'd get gassy, and she was in all sorts of discomfort. So I did trial a dummy in the early days to see if that would help. She didn't take it, so that's fine. But once my supply regulated, that didn't seem to be such an issue anymore. But that was something I needed to be mindful of. I used the Hucker pump. Hands down, best thing ever. I feel like I should be an ambassador because I am someone who hates pumping. I find it really, like laborious. It takes a long time. It's annoying. I don't know. It's just not my thing. Unfortunately, I'm never really away from my kids for the first year of life, so it's not like I need a big supply. But the Hucker catches your letdown, and so it's a way of building up a bit of a stash in the freezer without having to actually pump. And also, I didn't like the wastage of the letdown just going into your breast pad, so it kind of saves on like the milk spillage issue. So that was awesome. Now, in terms of sleeping for the first couple of weeks, what I aim to do, because, there's not always a lot of sleep in the newborn days. So my baby was waking sort of every 2 to 3 hours as a general routine for those first couple of weeks, which is very normal. And I would feed every time she woke, do a nappy change, then feed on the other side, then pop her back down. So what I would try and do to get maximum amount of rest is I would try and be in bed for a good 11, 12 hours overnight. So I would fall asleep when she goes to sleep at night, and I would get out of bed in the morning when she gets out of bed. And even if I was awake a lot overnight, at least I was lying down and I was horizontal. And I found that made a big difference. And obviously I was napping or lying down every afternoon as well, so that also made a difference. I didn't do this with my first 2 kids, and obviously I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm just literally sharing my story, that's all. But I am co-sleeping this time round. The reason I started doing that is because my pelvic floor was really vulnerable in the first couple of days and weeks after birth, and I didn't want to have to get up and down at nighttime to get her in and out of the bassinet. So I chose to co-sleep just so that I didn't have to do as much physical work, and it's been working really well, and so we're going to continue with that until it doesn't work, I guess. What I also did was set up a nappy station on my bedside table so that, again, I didn't have to get up and down overnight. So I would have nappies and wipes and burp cloths and all the things I needed so that I could kind of stay as comatose as possible, even though I was waking every 2 or 3 hours, because I would find that if I really had to wake myself up, like I got out of bed to go get a nappy, or, if I was putting her in and out of the bassinet, that sort of stuff really woke me up, and then I would find it hard to fall back to sleep. Whereas I kind of just stayed in bed and tried to lie down for as much of that as possible. And it meant that I actually was getting more rest and more sleep. So that worked really, really well for me. Also, from a sleeping point of view, I would make sure that I always looked forward to my morning coffee. So I'm a big coffee fan. And when you're up at 2 a.m. and you're just thinking, oh my God, it's going to be a long day, or I'm exhausted, it doesn't have to be coffee. But for me, I just always felt amazing knowing that there's only 4 hours until I can have a coffee, which probably sounds like I'm a massive coffee addict, which, you know what, maybe I am. But just having that thing to look forward to. So, okay, there's only this long until I can have a cup of tea, or only this long until I can have a shower, or I don't know, mentally that felt really good for me to always know, okay, I can have a coffee and I'm going to feel much better if I wasn't feeling good at the time. Now, in terms of the first 2 weeks, how my body felt, my back, my core, and my pelvis all felt fine. So I had no pain, I had no discomfort. I didn't, to be honest, even feel particularly weak. I didn't feel strong, but I didn't feel like I was going to fall apart any second. My pelvic floor felt quite heavy and throbby for the first few weeks. So you'll have listened back to my birth story. I did have a tear and that needed to be repaired. So it was mostly on the right side where my tear was. In fact, it was only on the right side in my pelvic floor area. So the right side felt, like I said, achy, throbby, heavy for the first few weeks. And I really couldn't stand or walk for longer than for the first couple of weeks, probably longer than 20 or 30 minutes. So I remember standing up. I think I was making myself breakfast, and then I had maybe walked around to do a couple of things, and then I had to sit back down again, or lie down, to be honest, because it just felt like everything was going to fall out and everything felt very achy. And I remember just thinking, this is really interesting. I'm really being mindful of my body and making sure I'm not pushing those boundaries, even though mentally I was frustrated that I couldn't be upright for more than, say, 20 or 30 minutes. I knew that physically I needed to honor that. That was my body sending me a signal saying, hey, girlfriend, you need to take it easy. We need a bit more recovery. And so for me, and I advocate this for all my clients as well, horizontal rest was the most important thing. So sitting down is not horizontal rest. Lying down is horizontal rest. So I would notice, I remember we had family come over one day and we were in the backyard for a couple of hours, and I sat down that whole time and I was sitting on a cushion and doing all the right things, but I was so achy by the end of that day because sitting down wasn't enough. You're still loading your pelvic floor up in sitting and you're still putting a lot of pressure through that area. So that was a really good lesson to practice what I preach and make sure I was actually trying to lie down as much as possible. I also remember going to the beach, which was probably one of my only outings for those first 2 weeks. And we pretty much got there. I stood up, I walked down to the sand, and then I was like, you know what? I wanted to go for a little beach walk, get some fresh air. I was like, I can't do this. And I was a little bit embarrassed because I was on the beach. And I couldn't even sit properly because it still felt throbby. So I actually had to lie down. So here I was on the beach lying down. It looked like I was just having a beautiful lazy day, but it was because my pelvic floor couldn't cope with the load if I was upright. So look, that's pretty intense, and it does feel like a long time ago because it's recovered very fast. But I think a lot of that recovery has been because I honored what my body was saying. I didn't go, you know what? I really want to go for a beach walk. So stuff you, pelvic floor. I'm just going to do what I want. I made sure that I said, oh, no, this doesn't feel right. I know I need to stop now. So I also remember when I was sitting, I kind of couldn't sit properly. I had to sort of lean away from that right side because of the pressure. It wasn't very comfortable. And I do remember my tailbone feeling a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit sore because of the change in my position. So again, this just reminded me to lie down more than sit. And it's not always possible to do that, I understand. I tried to lie down when I was feeding. And if not, I just tried to change my pelvic position a lot so that I wasn't overloading another area of my pelvis, i.e. my tailbone, because I didn't want that to then become a problem. I remember as well, in terms of pelvic floor recovery and how my body was feeling, that my first morning wee, there was quite a lot of stinging in my where my stitches were, which is very normal because your urine is often more concentrated first thing in the morning. So when that reminded me to just hydrate a lot during the day. I drank heaps of water. When my urine wasn't concentrated, I didn't have any stinging at all. But to combat that stinging, what I would do is flush it with I had this sitz bath that I would use, but I would just put it like in a little cup or a spray bottle, and I would flush that as I was weeing so that I didn't get the sting so much. So that really helped with that. And not that I needed to do it so much, but I do recommend this for my clients. And I did try it a couple of times, but for my first few bowel motions, I would get a wad of toilet paper and I would hold my perineum in really well so it felt supported while I opened my bowels, just so that I didn't feel that extra pressure. And I never strained, and I definitely recommend you don't strain, but just to give that extra bit of perineal support, that felt really good as well. In terms of the rest of my body, my breasts were like very full. I went through that typical day 3 or 4, felt like my boobs were a size Z feeling, but they regulated pretty quickly and they were no longer tender unless I had had a long stint in between feeds. That's probably the main summary of how my body felt in those first 2 weeks. Like I mentioned, in terms of specifically how my pelvic floor felt, that right side felt quite throbby and heavy if I was on my feet for too long. I did start very gentle, small pelvic floor contractions, exercises in the first couple of weeks. So what that felt like is that it felt quite sluggish. This is very normal, by the way. This is what you should expect after any birth, particularly vaginal delivery, but it felt quite sluggish. So let's say I usually used to lift my pelvic floor to level 3 or 4. I felt like I could only lift to level 1 and I could only hold it for a few seconds. And that is completely normal. All I was trying to do in those first few weeks, and all I advocate my clients do, is to get your brain to start talking to your pelvic floor again. So it's not about strongest, longest, most intense pelvic floor exercise you can do. It's just about waking that muscle up again. So getting your brain to go, hey, pelvic floor, I remember who you are. I remember where you are. And I kind of remember how to turn you on. That's all I was doing. So when I was feeding, I would just play around with, can I hold it? Can I let it go? Can I hold it? Can I let it go? That's all. There was nothing really structured or routine about it. It was just turning it on, turning it off. Other things that I did for my perineal recovery, so loads of horizontal rest, like I've already mentioned. I was very diligent with not lifting my other children. They weigh an absolute ton, and I was very diligent. So I said, no, I'm sorry, mummy can't lift you. I obviously made sure my husband was around so that I wasn't in a position where I had to lift them, or, you're in a dangerous position where you have to run after them or anything like that. I made sure that that wasn't the case. I never strained on the toilet. Touch wood, I also wasn't constipated, but I made sure that that was never an option. I did regular sitz baths. So I used the Mia Botanicals sitz bath, which had chamomile flower and things like that in it. And that felt really good. So on the days where I was particularly achy or throbby, those sitz baths, I felt amazing for doing them. So I tried to do them every day, but to be honest, that wasn't always possible. Because you have to soak for 15 minutes, and trying to get 15 minutes to soak doesn't sound like long, but with a baby and 2 other kids, it was kind of hard to find the time to do that. But I did try and do that every day for about 4 days in a row. I would regularly spray the Mia Botanicals Peri spray onto a maternity pad. That was just nice and soothing for my perineum. Now, in terms of icing, I do recommend ice for perineal recovery. However, there's some literature coming out at the moment that is talking about, in terms of overall long-term recovery, we're not actually sure ice is helping with that. So what I think the consensus is at the moment is ice is fantastic for pain relief, and we can all acknowledge, yes, that is true. In terms of overall long-term recovery, I'm not sure if ice is really where we're heading right now, and I don't think there's any set conclusion on that yet, but I took that information and I only iced for pain relief. I didn't ice as like a consistent routine. So I only iced once or twice just for some pain relief. That made a big difference. It felt really good. So I would recommend you do that for pain relief. What I would do sometimes is spray the perineal spray on a maternity pad, put it in the freezer, and then put that on, and that felt really nice. I kept the perineum dry and clean. I was very diligent with that. And as I said before, I would get a wad of toilet paper and support my perineum when I was opening my bowels. Now, in terms of exercise for the first couple of weeks, all I did was the occasional pelvic floor flick when I remembered, like I mentioned before, often when I was feeding. And I'm talking small walks. So 5 minutes really is probably all I did in the first 2 weeks, whether that would be around the house. I think I went to the beach maybe once or twice, and I think I might have gone around the block as well. But I actually rarely left the house for the first 2 weeks. And I'm someone who is quite a busybody, loves to get out of the house. I hate being confined at home. But I really lent into rest for the first 2 weeks this time. And so I actually found I didn't feel inclined to want to go out, which was interesting because, again, normally my personality is, get me out in the fresh air. I don't want to be stuck at home. But I actually didn't feel like it. So that was helpful, I guess, in that I wasn't itchy to leave. But I only did a couple of small walks. That was all. And again, my body was telling me that that was enough for me in those first couple of weeks. Now, in terms of how I felt emotionally, pretty good. So I've always had very steady mental health throughout all 3 children and birth and postpartum, fortunately. What I do notice, and this has been consistent with all 3 of my kids and in that initial postpartum period, is that I feel emotionally quite, I guess, vulnerable for the first few weeks. And what I mean by that is I feel very easily set off. So always sort of close to tears or close to some big, emotions welling up inside of me. If I'm very sensitive. And so I'm aware of that now that this is my 3rd kid, and I embrace that. And I know that that's just a really normal part of postpartumhood for me, maybe not for everyone, but for me. So that was fine. I know that I could easily get overwhelmed or emotional or upset. And so again, I just made sure I had help and buffers in place to make sure that, I could manage well. And I'm much better, again, maybe it's being a mum of 3 or maybe it's just being older and wiser, but I'm much better at communicating this time. So I do remember having a moment with my mum where I just started crying, and my other kids had gone out for a walk with my husband, and I was with the baby, and I was about to have a bath, and I just started crying. And my mum was like, "Oh my God, what's wrong? Can I fix it? Can I help?" Trying to problem solve. And I just said, you know what? I just need to cry. I'm not particularly sad. I can't pinpoint why I'm crying. I just know I need to cry, and it's not a bad thing. And I know I just need to get it out of my system. We don't need to fix anything. We don't need to solve anything. And that's not something past Laura would have done. That's something I've learned with time, is that sometimes I just need to have a cry, and I feel so much better afterwards for doing that rather than bottling it up, or also rather than putting a story on it that there's something wrong or, why am I sad? And I've just really lent into embracing a good cry, and I always feel a million times better for it. So that's something I probably am much better at doing as well to help emotionally get me through. If I need to cry, I cry. If I feel, feelings, I talk about them now as well. Like, I'm much better at communicating how I'm feeling, which is good. Another thing I do notice that I get, and I have had it with all 3 kids, is I get a teeny bit of anxiety sort of as that dinner routine is coming up, the sun's setting, you're gearing up for the nighttime, which can often be very hard and lonely when you've got a baby. You can feel like you're the only person awake, and there's a lot of wake ups. And look, I have felt that with all 3 of my kids, where I get a little bit of that anxiety leading up into the nighttime. Again, I knew what to expect this time. I didn't do anything particularly different. All I did was acknowledge it. So I would say to my husband, I'm noticing myself. I feel a bit anxious right now. And that was enough for me to feel better about it. And particularly, Luca had a blocked nose for like a good week or 2. And that was really disturbing her nighttime sleep. There was a lot of sleeping upright on me, a lot of just getting no sleep. And I was more anxious on those nights. So again, all I would say to my husband is, look, I feel quite anxious about how tonight's going to go. And we might talk through it, or he might say, well, would you like me to do this or this or this? And I just felt better for talking about it. So if anything I can recommend is just be really open with your communication and how you're feeling. And it doesn't have to make any sense, but just getting it off your chest can be amazing for just working your way through it. On the flip side of all of that, though, emotionally, I just felt a tremendous amount of love. So I would often find myself just sitting back and observing my parents or my husband or my other kids or my baby, and just feeling so full of love and gratitude for everyone and everything. So not to make it all sound doom and gloom or, like emotionally it's going to be really rocky. There's so much on the upside emotionally, I've found anyway, in the postpartum. So that's a really nice way to balance it out, I guess. And then the other thing I want to touch on before I wrap this podcast up, for the first 2 weeks, a big thing that I really planned for was to ask for and accept help from our community. So a big part of that was we had a meal train organized with our friends, which pretty much kept us going for the first 6 weeks, which was amazing. Again, I never did this for my first 2. This was a new thing and I highly recommend it to anyone. I also organized for my parents to come down and stay with us for about 4 nights in, I think it was the first week or 2. That also made an enormous difference. I know this is not always possible for everyone. I'm just sharing what was possible for us. That made a big difference. Just having those extra couple of set of hands for the older kids, or, can you hold the baby while I go and do this or whatnot. But that real village mentality, which again, this is the first time I've really lent into that. Oh, it made an enormous difference. And I was fortunate in that I had friends offering to take my older kids for a play date or to drop a coffee off at my house, or if they were at the shops, they would ask if I needed anything. And that offer of help was always so appreciated and really, really helpful. And again, I had organized to have my husband completely off work for 2 weeks. He works for himself, so that wasn't too hard to organize. But when you work for yourself, it's also kind of hard in that it's hard to completely switch off. You can kind of always work and always be on. And I made sure that he was aware that I guess the rules for me for the first 2 weeks is that I was not responsible for my older 2 kids at all. So I wanted to set that boundary really early so that I didn't feel like, well, I'll just help out with this, or I'll just quickly make dinner here. I wanted to make sure I let myself off the hook more than anything, because I knew that I'd be inclined to want to step in and help out and do too much, and then I would regret it. So that's a good summary of my first 2 weeks. And yeah, I guess if I were to give any advice, it would be organize help before the baby comes, accept help when the baby arrives, and factor in as much horizontal rest as humanly possible, because I tell you what, that does make an enormous amount of difference. Hey mamas, Laura here, and I really hope you got something out of today's episode. There is so much that I learned from my first 2 postpartum experiences that really helped to inform me of what I wanted to do for this 3rd postpartum journey. So resting properly and learning to lean on the help from others were the most important things this time around. And I tell you what, I do not have a single regret. It made such an enormous difference, and I really wish that I had done this sort of recovery the first 2 times. So if you enjoyed the episode or resonated with anything I share, I would love to hear from you over on my socials @PhysioLaura, and I would love to know if you've put anything in place to help make your postpartum recovery smoother. Now, in the next few episodes in my pregnancy and birth series, I'll be sharing my recovery from weeks 2 to 6, the differences I felt recovering from a vaginal delivery versus a cesarean section, my practical tips and tricks to help manage the day-to-day juggles with a family of 3 kids, and so much more. And if you haven't already, just subscribe to the Pregnancy with Physio Laura podcast so that you don't miss any of our upcoming episode in this podcast series. Now, I will catch you soon for episode 5 in this 7-part pregnancy and birth series, where I'll be sharing how I felt in weeks 2 to 6 after birth and what I did to help my recovery. Until then, mamas, sending you wonderful pregnancy vibes, and enjoy the incredible journey that is pregnancy.